welcome from the land of Australia. Whereabouts in Oz are you today?
Yeah, I'm on the East Coast near Byron Bay. So to all the listeners, particularly most of your listeners are probably in the UK. It's a very different time of the year.
It sounds lovely. Absolutely lovely. You've already hit me. So what's the time with you at the moment then, Bodhi? What time is it over
It's
there?
7 p.m.
7 p.m. Cool. Um, 8 a.m. here. I've literally just carted the kids out. I told my partner, don't let them upstairs. They were looking at me with that little grin, which makes me think they might jump through the door any moment. So fingers crossed. Um, I cannot wait to talk to you. I met you briefly, of course, we'll talk about that in a minute, but some of the things you spoke about were new to me, really, from a youth and community perspective. And I think that they're the kind of things that most people will find useful, let alone young people, let alone professionals that support young people and parents. So I'm so glad that you could come on and happy to come on, obviously, later on into your evening as well. So, first of all, do you want to say a little bit about? Can you remember when we first met?
Yeah, I remember the day we did in Campwell there, which was lovely. And, it was some foundational work that I teach. I was teaching with a colleague. And, when we met, your passion, and my passion, are very aligned. Obviously, dealing with youth, dealing with communities. Even though I work a lot with leadership and business organizations, I do a lot in my local community and have done a lot with youth in my local community. So it felt like a real synergy.
Yeah, I do remember. I went to the course thinking I was going to get a bit of insight because at the time I was writing a storytelling session and thinking, okay, I might pick up a few bits. I mean, don't get me wrong, I picked up a few bits, but I mean, I got a whole lot more. I even remember bursting into tears, which is not my standard kind of vibe when I meet new people. But what a hell of an experience! And those guys that I met then, we're still meeting up now. So look, thank you for being part of that. I don't know where that's going to go, but it feels like a very nourishing space to be in, and you were part of making it happen. So thank you from the off.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Great. You guys are still connected over there.
Yeah, yeah. I'd love to find out a bit more about you as well before we start talking about the work that you do and
Yeah.
ways to support young people and community. It'd be great to know a bit more about you as a person. So, what was it like for you growing up? Positives
Yeah.
and negatives.
Yeah. And as I was preparing for this podcast, I realized that, often I'm on podcasts talking specifically around the work I do with leaders around the globe. Yet it's a delight to also talk about the work I do have done and my experience, as I said, around youth and community. And so for me, my parents separated when I was 7 and essentially, single mum, work, social housing. And the one thing she absolutely committed to, because she'd come from middle class and suddenly found herself in working class, working 3 jobs, as I say, social housing, housing commission, was education. That was the big thing for her. And, she's passed away now, but I can still feel her presence. And, that was the gift she gave me. She worked 3 jobs so I could go to the local private school and always encouraged me to, do my best, I guess. And, I had an interesting childhood then because, my father wasn't living in the country for a while and certainly not living near us. And so suddenly the scaffolding of what it is to be a man, the masculine role models, just aren't there. And it's been a big thread of my life, the hero's journey for me being a man, which I'll talk more about. But what she did do by offering me education is she gave me a huge opportunity to step out of that, potentially, um, lower economic cycle, and that was the big trajectory for me. Interestingly, though, because what happened when I graduated from high school, and I did reasonably well, I said to my mum, what should I do? And she said, why don't you go and become a lawyer? And that's what I did. I did what good boys do. And, um, it was hard work for me, because at the same time, my wife and I have been together over 40 years, 45 years now, and we met at school and we went to university together. And so here I was navigating being a man, navigating, the opportunity my mum had presented in university with I was the first in my family to go to university. So it was, new territory. And one of the bits of advice I give youth is, and leaders and men, is that, how do we navigate uncomfortableness? How do we navigate the edge of our comfort zone? Because it's easy to stay in a comfort zone, because at the edge of your comfort zone, the uncomfortableness will come with a level of fear, anxiety, and that's often giving you useful information. And so, lent into becoming a lawyer, becoming a father, young, 4 children, now have 10 grandchildren. And with the absolute support and, absolute willingness of my wife to keep calling me forward. After 20 years as a lawyer, I got an opportunity to move into coaching and facilitation, which I've been doing globally the last 20
before
odd
we
years.
go into that, Bodhi, just a quick question, because it's interesting, probably for people in the UK, and the background you're talking about is fairly similar to myself, working class, council estate, da da da. But what I found interesting by what you said, and I wonder whether it's something maybe to do with your heritage, or maybe it's an Australian thing. So I'd say really that education isn't massively, especially with kind of white British working class kids, education's not looked at as that kind of way out, which is ridiculous because it is, but it's not looked at as that way out. And in some ways, it's looked at as uncool, to even kind of be engaged in that kind of thing. Is it the same in Australia? I mean, Australia, I know, like the UK is very diverse, people from all over the world. But I know that you told us when we were at the Camp Wales session, you had like different heritage. Do you think it was because of the heritage of your family that you were directed towards education, or is it a general Australian thing that actually people from all different backgrounds really do utilize education as a way out of poverty?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I guess there's many layers to it. My first cut would be that it's probably quite similar here. I think the difference for me was my mother had actually been relatively middle class and had gone into the trajectory of the housing estate.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't as if she had grown up in a housing estate. Her parents had grown up in a housing estate. And I think that cycle of, the role models, I think that can be systemically quite challenging, because for youth that have never seen anything different, and parents who've never seen anything different, and anti-establishment is such a key part. It's very, very easy when you're in a housing estate to have the victim mentality. It's them and us.
Yeah.
It's us against the wealthy. It's up against the government. It's us against the teachers. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. It just can be ingrained, and it can hold you as a victim. The victim mentality, again, can be such a handbrake on reaching your potential. And it's one of the first shifts that I guess we make in conscious development, is moving from the victim of your life to the author of your life. And it's a big shift, and it usually comes on the hero's journey. It does come with a level of waking up, realizing that you're not the victim, that you're not at effect, that there is a part of you that can influence your life and your journey. And again, I'm not saying that's easy, with the barriers to entry for minority groups, for girls. There's a lot of barriers to entry. The education system itself doesn't necessarily encourage and foster,
No,
children
it
from
doesn't.
diverse backgrounds. Yeah, yeah. Um,
It's just, I mean, I think today we are going to go like that, and I know you
yeah,
can roll with it, so it's great. But I mean, I wonder, I suppose, with the UK education system, through no fault of the teachers, do you know what I mean? They're having to deal with what comes from above, and how narrow the education system has become. It doesn't
yeah,
promote the other kind of creative, practical ways of doing things, which open up people's minds to think of another way. For people that
yeah,
aren't necessarily academic, that they can thrive in other ways. And they don't, you know, if they haven't grown up with, like you said, with those role models of seeing what other people have done and what is possible, they only have that blinkered kind of look at things. I mean, I wonder, is there anything practical that you can think of when you're starting that journey and maybe you're hearing this, you're a parent, you're a young person, whoever, a professional. What are those starting points? Are there things you practically can do?
yeah. It's again, we're there's many angles we can take this conversation. I think if I bring it back to the journey for parents and for youth, and having worked with a lot of parents and a lot of youth, and again, we don't know what we don't know. So any of the parents listening, and again, I'm not exactly sure of your demographic yet. The Bristol area community, those sorts of things. Um, what I know is that in adult development, now there's a lot of studies that have been done around childhood development and childhood milestones. Most people accept that the 2-year-old moving to the 5-year-old, moving to the 10-year-old, there are certain milestones physically, emotionally, mentally. But what is a big body of work that's underrepresented is that we know that adult development is important as well. That just because we turn 18 or 21, it doesn't stop our own learning and self-awareness and growth. So any of the parents listening here, my invitation to you is to really seek out the teachers, the mentors, the guides, the community members, the elders who can support you to expand your parenting awareness. Yeah, because there's 3 types of parenting. And again, if we're going to break cycles here, so one type of parenting which most of us experienced is authoritarian parenting. That's all about the parent. Do this, do that, don't mess with it. Eat your food. I'm the boss. The other extreme, which we've seen not far from you in places like Glastonbury and Byron Bay, is laissez-faire parenting, where it's all about the child. Oh, little
As much as
Johnny,
that.
he's lovely. Yeah, it's okay if he throws a rock at the car. He's just learning to throw. There's no boundaries. Yep, it's an extreme. One is about the parent, the other is about the child. But the key, if any of the parents listening, is what's called collaborative parenting. I'm in relationship with this little person. How do I collaborate with them? How do I develop them? And again, parents start developing those skills. They start to realize, and the conversations we've had about rites of passage. So the journey for young boys and young girls in traditional cultures, which I've been very involved in, there were always rites of passage. And the rites of passage were initiations that most of us as adults didn't go through as children. So, for example, when I work with teenage boys, so you go from little boy, usually up until about 7 or 8, and then you go into big boy. 7 is usually an initiation in traditional cultures. You're basically developing more responsibility. You need to develop more resilience. You need to develop more emotional intelligence. You then go from big boy to young man, and that's puberty. So the rites of passage work that I've done, and there's some great teachers over here, often in traditional cultures, the boys were literally, quote unquote, stolen from their mothers and taken into the desert with the Aboriginal elders. And they were then with all of the men and initiated into what is it to now be a young man. So that the mother wound, as we know in Jungian terms and in psychology, is such a huge thing for men. And the advantaged men, disadvantaged men, they haven't dealt with their mother stuff. because they were never initiated into manhood. And that's one of the primal initiations, is you've got to deal with your mother stuff, which again is probably another whole podcast. And then, that's right. And then from young man, again, usually at the age of, 17, 18, when you're strong enough, physically enough, capable of contributing to the tribe, you're initiated into manhood. And a client was reminding me the other day of, most of your listeners would have seen in some cultures when they dive off the cliffs with the rope tied around their legs. I don't know if you've seen any of that, where it's an incredibly
wow.
It's in South America, yeah, but it's an initiation process.
Okay.
Anyone who's interested now, just Google it on YouTube. It's incredibly, because it's a rite of passage, which is so important.
So I'm hearing what you're saying, and I'm connecting it back with, there's a lot of, I think of just me growing up, most parents were divorced. I don't think I actually knew anyone when the parents were still together, which is kind of ridiculous. I know these things go in cycles. I think probably, my generation are more likely to stay together because they've been through the impact of that separation. I suspect, I don't know what research is out there, but I suspect it goes like that. And because of those situations, most people normally end up staying with their mums, would be the kind of norm. And I guess there's no initiation, there's no fatherly figure around. Is the reality.
Exactly.
And that, to kind of flip it to the communities that the grassroots community supports, and probably most other communities, underserved communities across the city, the UK, and probably elsewhere, there's a whole lot of broken families, for a variety of reasons. And the men, a lot of the time, aren't around. I guess, interestingly, what you said about the kind of the parenting skills and kind of connecting with those that can support. In the UK, there used to be something called Sure Start years ago, which basically used to support with parenting. For this was government funded stuff. But as you can imagine, and as you probably know, or you can even guess, all this stuff was wiped out way back when. So that support for families in, like I said, more underserved communities doesn't exist. So if you don't, you come from generations of not having that father figure, or not having necessarily the parenting style that you'd hope of, which you spoke about, that's all you've ever known. And I think we're in that cycle now. I go out in the communities and, that we work in, and what I said, like, when I was growing up, it's the same deal now. The limitations on positive male role models aren't there. And I guess it's like this flow, isn't it? Because the dads didn't have it either. And where does it stop? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And that's obviously the work you do, the work I've done. So to give you a snapshot of how we've tackled it here. So, apart obviously from the leadership work I do, I help establish the local youth service here in 2010. And we were seeing exactly that. There was some disadvantaged youth, and particularly the boys, and risk-taking is an important part of being a teenager, as you know, yet without a container, without a mentor, they were just lost. And so to me, to answer your question, and the solutions, and I love the word grassroots, because I believe all of this transformation, it's got to be top down and grassroots up. So what we set up here, small community, 3,000 people. The first thing I did, particularly with my business background, I went to all the businesses, said, look, cup of coffee a week, $5 a week. Yeah. If each of you are willing to donate that, I can pay for a part-time youth worker. Yeah. And it literally 50 businesses, $5 a week. Yeah. Done. Direct debit, automatic transfer. We've got a budget. We can now employ a part-time youth worker. The second was obviously getting a good group of volunteers, and people. What I know about volunteering, and what I've seen, having volunteered for many, many years, is I can ask pretty well everyone in this community to help, but the first thing they say is, I don't want to go to meetings. That's the key. Yeah, exactly. You know, some people do have strengths in treasurer, admin, and things like that, but it's the meetings that kill them because it's dominated by one or two personalities. You're talking around the circles. And so again, just, you know, for any of the listeners who are wanting to set something up in their local community, you know, and so if you can get the local businesses, you know, £2 a week, whatever, £3 a week, yep. If you can get a small handful of volunteers and basically don't get bogged down in meetings, what we did, particularly we started with the boys, now we have some incredible programs for the girls, is the first thing is you have to build trust, and trust comes from non-judgment. So what we were seeing is the elderly in our community were fearful because the boys were, you know, whatever, being young boys, riding their skateboards, throwing rocks, whatever it was. And the children were feeling really judged by the elderly. So we were able to do a pop-up premises in the main street in the high street of our village. And it was amazing, Ben, because what happened is suddenly everything became more visible. And it was incredible. And I'm sure, you know, the studies are clear about visibility in youth space. And the elderly were coming out of the supermarket, and the young boys were encouraged to help them get their stuff to the car. And we were breaking down barriers. And then the final piece, because I could bang on all night, as you know, all day, is the two things that young men want. And I would say it's similar for young women. Yeah, which once we broke down the trust, the key thing is we listened to them, we didn't tell them, like you do. Yeah, we got them to design what they wanted. But underneath it all, the two things they wanted, was belonging and purpose. That was the key. They felt they belonged to our community. They weren't marginalized, they weren't ostracized, they weren't judged. Again, these are generalizations, but suddenly they felt they belonged. This is my community. Not in a tribal sense, you know, like a gang, but in a real sense. I'm part of a village, I'm part of a tribe. And then purpose, a reason to get out of bed.
I mean, that's a great example. Listening to that, there's loads of similarities to things that we've done over here, and people have done all over the world. And interestingly, when I hear you say that, it makes me think, and exactly those two things, belonging and purpose, is what comes out of that rite of passage that you were talking, that would have been, you know, delivered by those elders way back when, whether it be going out into the desert, going out into the woods, and all those kind of things. And the irony is that part of the problem of that in the UK is that the youth service was literally completely dismantled, pretty much, devastated, and what's left is not a great deal. But I agree with you, and some of the stuff that we've done is, if you've got someone that knows their stuff, and then they can help mobilize local volunteers and help train them in whatever things they might need to understand. And goodwill goes a hell of a long way, and especially when it's super localized, with people that know the gran, know the dad, know the mum, and then the fears of being around those young people and actually just being there for them. And like you said, non-judgmental. It's a beautiful thing, and you support them to develop things that matter to them. And I'm sure there's lots of people that might listen to this that might not be from that youth work background, that do care about what they're seeing is going on in their communities over here. And there is a way, isn't there? That's the thing.
The grassroots, you know, this is where we get bogged down, you know, because so many of the youth models have got caught up in bureaucracy and caught up in government grants. If you think of the key stakeholders, if I'm a local business and it costs me £3 a week, to employ a part-time youth worker, if I can get a pop-up shop, you know, which, you know, there's lots of vacant premises around, and if I can harness, you know, get a paid youth worker and some volunteers, we can avoid all of the bureaucracy of having to go to the government for grants, having to tick every box and every jargon and jingo there is to try and get a grant. We don't have to go cap in hand to the big company saying we need £50,000 and everything. It's literally 50 businesses, £5 a week. Yeah. Tell me what you could do with, 25,000 quid. You could make an impact.
It's huge. I think of just something that we've done on a similar line to that. Loads of antisocial behaviour going on in Arcliffe, an area around here. We supported young people through building relationships with them out on the street for a number of weeks. Eventually, a young person kind of stepped up, wanted to set up a boxing club. From a challenging background himself, you wouldn't necessarily see him going in that direction normally. I am speeding it up big time, but long story short, we supported them to learn the skills, set up their own youth-led boxing club. They delivered the whole thing. We went to different places for training so they could learn from other specialists. Even in lockdown, they were delivering online box fit sessions.
Fantastic.
Because they still wanted to do that. Moving on after that, they continued the program. They were doing junior sessions for 8 to 12-year-olds. They were doing targeted girls sessions, targeted boys sessions, involved in ASB. And basically, we were just getting a bit people. It wasn't even businesses. It was just literally anyone that could donate. It was at Christmas. I can't remember how much it was. I think it was something like a tenner. And then we tried, what happened? We tried charging the young people that were coming a quid, so it would pay for the young leaders who delivered it, and there was a youth worker there just supervising. But based on the nature of the area, people don't have that kind of money. That might sound crazy to people, but that's the reality of life. So
exactly. It's a different. Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned a key thing: the young leaders. So this is another thread which, I think we need to put a lens on, So I work a lot with senior corporate leaders globally. Yeah. But what I know is that communities, businesses, politics lack leadership. You and I are talking 2 days after the new US president has just come in 2025. The role models of leadership, the schools don't teach leadership. That's a generalization. I think some of them do. And if I can just talk a little bit to leadership, and any of the listeners here, if you're a part of a community, and one of my bugbears, Ben, is any white man who's 55 plus, who's thinking about retiring and playing golf, and talking about shit and reading the paper, like, I'm going to clip them over the ears. The most entitled, the most privileged, the most entitled, the most influential people on the planet. It's absolutely essential that they give back. I want to do a golf course tour of the UK where I can just clip these guys over the ears. This is not okay. I know. Exactly. This is not okay. It is not okay to spend 3 days a week on a golf course talking shit. You beg your pardon?
Why though? Why would you say that? I mean, I get what you're
because
on about,
they've had the most entitled, privileged path that they don't even realize. They go, there's no barriers to entry. What a crock. If you're from a minority group, if you're a young girl, the barriers to entry, these guys, and this is a huge generalization, I know, these guys have no way. When I work in businesses, I work a lot around balancing the masculine and feminine energy in the boardroom. These guys, they have no idea the privilege and entitlement that the pathway that they've had. Yet that then leads into the golf course to sit around and start talking about shit or get lycra and go bike riding. Nothing wrong with either of those. But once they realize the privilege and entitlement, it's absolutely essential they give back.
I mean, I wonder, and I'm kind of playing devil's advocate a little bit, but I'm not from that background, and it's highly unlikely I'm going to be doing any of that stuff. But I get what you're saying, and a lot of people will understand exactly what you're saying as well. I guess it's a similar kind of thing as what you're talking about with people growing up with, they might have all the love around them, but less kind of finances, less stability in that situation. So that's the norm. And I'm guessing, playing devil's advocate for people that have grown up in more privileged situations, they've known no different. This is what I sometimes I should shut my mouth, but I find that difficult talking to certain. Do you know what I mean? We have to go cap in hand because of the limitations within funding to try and kind of get
Yeah,
businesses to help sponsor different things that make a difference that really the government should be paying for. And in the end,
yep,
it supports the whole of society, not just those underserved communities. And I
yep.
absolutely, you can see it, can't you, bro? You can read people's body language. When you start talking, or maybe it's just me, I don't know, maybe it's just when I start talking to people in more privileged situations that do have a key to unlock some finances and other support that or skill sharing that could support, young people to be the changes they want to see. You can kind of see straight away, they're like, oh, they want something. Oh, yeah, this is always this thing. It's another one. And sometimes I just think, you get to a stage like we're going to be doing an evening with soon, and it's going to be with businesses. And sometimes you feel like people come along because they're asked to come along by other privileged people, and they kind of show their face. But when it comes to actually doing something, some kind of action, it feels like, and I might be wrong, you need to have a relationship and a connection with those people directly. And I suspect that somehow comes from affiliations to other people in that same privileged background. Otherwise, you're firing, stuff
Mm,
that lots of other people are, and it feels like the visors are down. I mean,
yeah,
I don't know. What would you
yeah.
say
No,
to that?
yeah. I mean, it's a good observation, I think, and there's again many layers to it. The fundamental piece is this: that leadership. So, if I can just talk about leadership a little bit. So, a simple definition of leadership is influence. So, essentially, if you look at a community, look at a village, look at a business, in some way, everybody's influencing. Everyone is leading in some way, informal leadership and formal leadership. Yeah. And we've lost community leadership. Yeah. And it's not just based on economics. Yourself, growing up in a housing estate, they were the elders there, even, the grandmother, it's like they had the wisdom. Yeah.
Patriarchal societies, mostly.
Ex- exactly. Yeah. And so what breaks down the barrier between the privileged and the underprivileged is cultivating leadership. The privileged, I hear what you're saying, that they will listen to someone of their own kind of economic status, but they're also looking to be led. Yeah, they need to be led as well. Yeah, and the two keys to leadership, then in corporate, in sport, in anything, are connection and direction. Yeah, that's the key. And so, again, for any of the listeners, even in your community, grassroots, you've got to find ways to connect with these privileged men, and you've got to direct them. And it's probably going to be, and listeners now, there's people listening to your podcast, there's people in your community who actually are privileged white men who can make a difference here because they can connect. And we're not asking for hundreds of thousands of pounds. We're not asking for hours of their time. Yeah. All we're looking for is, again, it's a willingness to be part of the change.
It could be knowledge sharing. It could be connections, networking. The reality is, the more the government don't finance this kind of stuff, and the more money we
Yeah.
invest now as an
Yeah,
intervention, we spend
exactly.
less in the long run, and it benefits everyone. And I think there's lots of, I mean, just to caveat everything, there's lots of good, well-meaning people that do support us from different backgrounds of privilege. So this is not just, I'm not just slating people because I'm not.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
it kind of it linked in with
Well,
what you were
the
saying. It
the
was just,
the
it's the
thing,
connection
and
bit, isn't it? It's being
exactly, it's
comfortable
the connection.
around.
It's the connection piece, and then the direction. It's giving them clear direction. One of the things coming from a business background is the youth service model isn't commercially agile enough. it's too layered, it's too bureaucratic, it's too government influenced. And again, that has its place. But what we did here, we are totally community driven. We have no government funding at all. It's all driven by the community and local business. But it allows us to be very agile. It allows us to keep the bureaucracy very thin. You know, but the point I'm making, I guess, is that if you look at the opportunity for a different business model on how we deliver youth services. Yeah, it's complementary to the traditional model, but it literally, and that's what I saw when I lent into this in 2009, 2010, you know, I looked at it and went, that model of government grants and handouts is a tricky model. You're constantly on edge. Your funding runs out. You spend more time with grant writers and admin people than getting to the youth. Whereas, again, if we're talking to that demographic of people with business acumen, with a level of wealth, like I say, 50 businesses, £5 a week, there's a youth worker. You do that in those little villages around you, have a simple structure and be really agile. Most businesses don't even know £5 a week's coming out of their account, but they're making a difference, you know.
I guess to add to that very briefly is you know, and we've seen that work. We've developed a year-long program called GAP and other versions of it, Mini GAP and Youth GAP, and large parts of that, individual young people were sponsored by meaningful business people, you know, with a purpose. And then not only do they support financially, they'd support with the mentoring as well. I guess the key thing, and this is links in with what you're saying, is the only reason I mention it, is the kind of the thing you need to think about fairly quickly is how you keep that relationship and connection nourished, because there's so many in a big city like Bristol, and but there's so many people wanting a piece of the pie, trying to do the right thing in you know, for various reasons. You need to, and in some ways it does exactly what you're saying. It ends up taking people that really, like me, though, as a youth and community worker, end up doing a lot of the other stuff, which is, you know, what has to be done, which is not really the best use of my time. But you've got to do it, and it's tricky, but.
Well, the key thing, and again, this is all great in theory, and I know it's not easy in application. Is so if I arrived, what was the name of the village you mentioned where the boxing started?
Oh, it's just it's a community in Bristol, Parkcliffe, South Bristol.
Yep. So Parkcliffe, is it?
Yeah.
Yep. If I went to Parkcliffe, and does it have its own little shopping centres or coffee shops and things like that?
Not really. It has one big supermarket. It is like, you know, it's got lots of great things going on in a sense of community, but it's quite deprived poverty-wise. So that hasn't got a lot of those kind of things.
Yeah. If I went to that supermarket, I think you could quickly find out, you know, over a couple of weeks, who were the influences in that community.
That's how we found the young person that started the boxing club through, because things were getting nicked from there, and they were basically targeting and tormenting the security guards, and it was like local people felt unsafe. It was all going off, and that's how we kind of we turned that round. I'm looking at the time, Bodhi, and you've got so many pearls of wisdom. I'm going to try and move you on, because I want to get as much out of you as possible. I mean, one thing that I heard you mention before about the role of parents today, and I wonder whether you could kind of throw a bit more light on that. So we've spoken about, you know, rite of passage and that kind of thing, and but maybe the role of parents today, about, so there's an understanding that we aren't necessarily, maybe we're trying to do too much, and there's other ways. So I'll over to you.
Yeah. So do you mind if I use you as an example and maybe live workshop it just to give the audience you know, because again, I can bang on with all the theories in the world, but it's, you know, and again, your demographic shifts, you know, I imagine there's quite a range in your demographic, but just give me the snapshot. You've got the two little ones. What ages are they now?
So 7 and 10.
Yep. And you both work full-time, part-time?
Well, at the moment, my partner's between jobs, but generally we both work full time. The kids, we have to pay for them to go to after school clubs so we can still work to pay the rent, and and then you start questioning, bloody hell, then I'm out working with other young people. Then you're thinking,
Yeah.
am I actually spending time on my own kids? Anyway, that's more information than you needed.
That's okay. If you don't mind, I'll sort of unpack and coach you a little bit. What's the biggest tension you find as a parent then? We won't jump into your marriage. We can do that another time. But just as a
Yeah,
parent,
we haven't got enough time. No, I guess the tension is that I had lots of challenges growing up. I had one parent, my mum around, and my mum passed away when I was quite young. And knowing that I wanted to have kids, I wanted to be there for them and around for them. As a job, I've spent most of my life supporting young people a lot of the time in really challenging situations, to be the changes they want to see. Then I suddenly find myself, I'm flat out trying to run a small charity because I'm so driven and passionate about making a difference. And then I think, hang on a minute. Don't get me wrong, I see my kids and I take them to clubs and all the rest of it. But like it's probably the same stuff as you talk about with business people. I'm always up here thinking about how I can kind of, fund the next thing for those other staff that work for me, and that problem that's going on with that young person. And then it's like, what's
yeah,
going on? I need to water my own garden.
yeah, exactly. So the biggest gift you can give your children, particularly infants, is presence. And that's not just physically being there, it's being present. And exactly the point you shared, and this is what I see working with business leaders who are parents and couples and things. One of the courses I run is called From Distraction to Presence. We've allowed ourselves to become so distracted. Yeah. And we have 60,000 thoughts a day, and most of them are negative. Yeah. We basically are living in a world where that, the dopamine hit, the phone, when I work with couples, the wives say to me, if you can just get my friggin' husband off the phone. Yeah. And so, there's plenty of evidence, there's plenty of literature, Johan Hari, we can put in the show notes, Hari, has written some incredible Swiss English author. He's one of his books is called Stolen Focus. And we really are becoming the victims to distraction. And so there are many layers to your question about how to help parents. Yeah, we've touched on parenting styles and things like that. But, what I find one of the foundational things as a parent and certainly as a leader is, is there a way that I can cultivate more presence with my children, more presence with myself, more presence with my beloved, my partner. And that takes a little bit of commitment and discipline and rigor.
Could you share a couple of because I've heard you've got an amazing podcast which we'll plug now if you want to plug at the end. But I mean I've learned loads of stuff listening to that. And I wonder whether you could just share a couple of tools for people feeling more present. I think one thing I've done recently, I've got two phones. I've got a burner phone and I got a work phone. And
Yep.
because of exactly what you're talking about. But there's lots of things that you've discussed before. Could you share a couple of those, Pete?
Yeah. And again, for the listeners, please, there are exceptions. I realize, and working with trauma-informed adults and trauma-informed children, the nervous system work, and my wife's an expert in that space. This isn't easy if you're coming from a background where there's a lot of trauma-informed and impact on your nervous system. So please excuse, my privileged simplification of these concepts, because I'm not saying this is easy. As a generalization, for most people who have a level of, entitlement, a level of privilege, a level of financial security, and again, if you don't mind me using yourself, like, someone in your situation, you can find 5 or 10 minutes a day, to get more present with yourself. You know, and that's one of the anchor points. If any of the listeners are serious about this, one of the most simple and one of the most difficult things to do, and I invite each of you to do it, is to find somewhere in the house, for 5 minutes or 10 minutes where you can just sit, and have no distractions, no phones, no to-do lists, no, devices. Basically, you can, sit with a cup of coffee if you want, or a cup of tea. But the fastest way to get present, is you train your body, and you'll train your mind, and you train your body like you train a dog. The beautiful work of Joe Dispenza, it's like you just train your body to sit, just sit, just sit. Now, what will happen, and this is the challenge for you, my friend, I'm going to talk to you in 1 month's time, and you're going to commit to this. 3 times a week. I want you to just sit for 5 minutes somewhere. And hopefully as you move into better weather over there, you might be able to do it in a garden or in a park or something like that. I realize at the moment it'll be indoors. What will happen then is your thinking mind will scream and kick, and it does not want to sit still. That's why you've got to train your body. I would say everyone that's listening has 5 minutes a day where they can sit without any distractions. If you're willing to cultivate that, do that 3 times a week, 5 times a week, it is a game changer. And I get some people who say to me, Ben, that, meditation's not for me. My mind didn't stop. It's not for anybody initially. It's like going to the gym 3 times and expecting to be fit. Like it takes a little bit of practice,
I guess the thing as well, to kind of to people that might listen to talk of doing things like meditation, yoga, and think, well, what, that's all this, whatever, arty farty, blah blah blah, whatever their thoughts might be. It's no different than the stuff that we do when we don't do so much of it now, when we take people out into nature, bushcraft weekends, and all that kind of stuff. Just try these things, and once you feel it yourself, you don't have to listen to people like Bodhi or me or anyone else talking about it. It's like, once you feel it, you know it, and it isn't bullshit. That's the reality, isn't it? And it's just stuff.
Exactly. And that's the second piece I was going to say, which is perfect, is the nature. Get yourself into nature. Local park. Again, I know you're in the middle of winter, but if you can get yourself into nature, we know that everything is energy, everything is frequency and vibration, and nature is our natural vibration. And I would say most of the listeners have had an experience when they've been in nature, where they've felt calmer, felt more present, felt grounded. And that can be the local park. If you're lucky enough to have a garden, it can be the garden. It can be, obviously, near where you are, there's lovely woodlands and things like that. But that's another key piece. Is a really powerful tool.
Yeah, no, I agree. I definitely know that my kind of creative juices start flowing a lot more when I'm out in nature, and it generally ends up being the catalyst for different things, whether it be work or home related, to put stuff in its place, and kind of you can kind of look at it from a bit of a distance and reflect and everything else. I mean, I wonder that there might not be anything like straight away, but I wonder if there's any more tools that you can, that are fairly like simple, that you can maybe suggest that might support people to be, in a better place in their life. I know, I mean, that's very broad, but
that's okay. And again, I know you've got a broad range of listeners. The studies are really clear. So the most effective leaders, and they measured this, they got them to diarize what they were doing, is the most effective leaders had a daily reflective practice. They took time out to reflect. Now, reflection doesn't have to be meditation, cross-legged, looking at the wall. It can be contemplation. It can be prayer. It can be, sitting still. one of the most powerful reflective tools is to start writing in a journal. Yeah. And again, you know, any of the listeners, it's not some big thing. It's like just buy an exercise book, take 5 or 10 minutes a day and just start writing down and reflecting on, how did I show up today? How was I as a parent today? How did I show up with my wife? How did I show up at work? You know, you can then bring in things like being a bit more grateful, you know, gratitude. It's like, I'm really grateful, you know, that we have a roof over our head, you know, appreciation, you know, it's again, all of this is simple, not easy. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I've heard of these kind of things before, but it's good. It's good to kind of put this out to others that may have heard it, may not. I mean, even that thing about, you know, 2 things, 3 things you're grateful for at the end of the day, with your notepad at the side of your bed,
Yep.
to make you feel better about your lot, because it can always
Yeah,
be worse, can it? But actually,
exactly.
there's a lot
Yeah,
to be thankful for.
exactly. You know, yeah, definitely. Another interesting thing, certainly when I work with young men, you know, there's a saying that, you know, the 3 most important men in your life, yeah, you know, one is, you know, who is your peer group? You know, who is your mentor, and what's the relationship like you have with yourself? So for any parent out there, like who are the people you're leaning into? Who are the conversations you're having? Like, we do this as a village. It takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village to support a parent, you know, and reach out, you know. Again, I know it's tricky, particularly for the fathers. You know, a lot of men can feel inhibited to ask for support, ask for conversations, but just notice, who am I talking to regularly? Are they inspiring me? Are they uplifting me? Are they supporting me? Yeah. Or am I just getting caught up in their conversation? And find a mentor, find an elder, find somebody. You know, most people can look around and go, you know what, there's a role model. I really love the way that grandmother, you know, deals with her children, or that, you know what I mean? Like, again, none of this is rocket science. Does that make sense?
It does, and it links very clearly to something I heard you say a while back, and I even said it to someone that I work with, because there was stuff going on with their kids, and it's interesting from the point of view of being a youth worker for God knows how long. When I think about those thousands of kids that have been supported by me, us, over a number of years, and you look at their distance travelled from that young person that turned up at that youth club or that project or in that school, whatever it is, and through that support that they may not have had in other ways and at other places or at home or whatever, and then the situation, I mean, not all, obviously some, you know, life isn't easy. But for some, it's having that person that isn't part of the family that
Yep.
cares wholeheartedly and will go the extra mile. And you said something specifically about this, so I don't want to take your win, because you're going to say it a lot better than I can. Could you explain that a little bit? Because a lot of parents just be like, let's not listen to me. I'm trying to. They might be all friends. I'm trying to
Yeah.
effing flipping blah blah blah, and then it ends up being a pressure
Yeah.
cooker, doesn't it?
Yeah. And before I answer it specifically, there's a great on YouTube. There's a documentary, I guess, or a seminar. A guy called Dan Siegel. You may have come across him, Siegal. I think we'll put it in the show notes. But he's done a great presentation on the teenage brain. Yeah. So we now know from neuroscience, from biology, what teenagers are going through. And there's a term where the brain is pruning itself. The neuroplasticity is pruning. The wiring is being pruned to rewire. And so anyone with teenagers, please understand, they're not always doing it willfully. There's a biology behind this. But the piece to answer your question is that, so the biggest influence in a teenage life, becomes their peer group. And boys learn from other men, not their fathers. And so any parent out there who has a teenage boy, notice the peer group, and also get good men in their life, uncles, football coaches, teachers, you know, boxing, martial arts, whatever. Yep. And it doesn't have to be hugely structured, but it's a way that they can essentially hear from another man. Yep. Hear it differently. They'll hear it differently from hearing it from their parents.
And then, with that being the case, and I think, like I said, I think traditionally that's the role of the youth worker, but lots of other, like you're saying,
Yep.
sports and things. But then, from the view of the parent, what should the mum or the dad feel like? I know this is real generalized, but how should they feel like their role is? So they know that they don't feel like, oh, I'm not really connecting with them in the way that I should be, because you said something before which helps understand that. Do you know what I mean? That might give people a bit of
Yep.
peace of mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And in traditional cultures, so young girls push away from the father and young boys push away from the mother. Yeah. And that's part of the rite of passage. And so what you've got to realize is, and again, if you've got the skill set, the key with parenting, and it's interesting now, certainly in my generation, we thought that we had to get them to 18 and then they became adults. Yeah. And, certainly possibly for yourself, when we're 16, 17, we're all leaving home, getting on with our lives. The truth is now the studies are clear around the development of the brain and also what's happening in society, COVID, the developmental stages for teenagers is essentially it's about 25 when they become independent. So your role as a parent is to go, what sort of young man, what sort of young woman do I want them to be at 25? What are the skills they need? Yep. What are the life skills they need? The decision-making skills they need, the responsibility skills that they need. There's tension between freedom and responsibility. So even though the intimate relationship can change when they're teenagers, the peer group becomes important. They, grunt. The boys will go through the grunting phase, It's also to realize that whether you like it or not, you're going to be the parent for the rest of your life. And it's a beautiful gift to know the milestones that you want them to reach. For young boys, I talk a lot about their relationship with the feminine, talk a lot about how they treat women, talk a lot about emotional intelligence, talk a lot about, the contextual tension, Ben, for teenagers, is between freedom. They want more freedom and responsibility. And so it's important to give them more freedom, but it's also for them to take some responsibility. Yeah. And they have to push back at you. You've got to hold the boundaries. My wife talks about it's like if there's a staircase and there's handrails, you are the handrails. They've got to push. They've got to learn how to be themselves. So don't try and authoritarianly control them. Don't laissez-faire. Don't have no boundaries. Fundamentally, all children want is boundaries and consistency. And those boundaries are based on their developmental age. For the 15-year-old who wants to push and get angry, it's like hold a boundary, push back a little bit. Yeah, but don't shut them down. Giving them emotional intelligence, emotional skills is such a key part of it.
Good advice. Not easy, as we know, in the heat of the moment and the pushing and the the moving to kind of to get what you want and what you don't want. I think you said something before about the the young person, your child, whether it's like not setting those boundaries, but then making a decision. But you kind of maybe having the wider boundaries set,
Exactly.
So they're taking agency in what they're doing, supporting them to grow and everything else. But that you're not giving them complete living, do what you want, because then at that point they might go right off and do something silly.
Yeah. And they've got to push, young boys need to take risks, but they've got to be managed risks. They don't have any boundaries. That's when we see the tragedies. And if you don't give them the chance to push, and then we see compliant children who don't actually develop the skills.
Bodhi, I literally could ask you a lot more questions, but I know that it's later on at night in Oz. It's early in the morning here, and I don't want to take the mic. It's been great to be able to chat to you. And when you're in the UK next, I don't know if you're planning on meeting up with that group again, or or what, but
Yeah.
it'd be great to stay
And
in touch in some way. But
yeah, and also an invitation to you and your listeners to, just any of the listeners, send some questions to Ben. Like, this is a conversation, obviously 10 grandchildren, 4 children, been married for 45 years, been together for 45 years, married for 40 years. I've kind of been around the block a little bit. And, I want to be that elder for as many people. So please, any of the listeners, feel free, shoot in a question, challenge it, question it, ask for it. If you're serious about being the best version of yourself as a parent, I'm happy to be a resource to, direct you where I feel it can help you.
well, that is a very kind offer, and I'm going to take you up on that. And
Yeah,
there's people out there, and to reach out to others around them as well.
yeah,
Like you were saying, just reach out to people and take on people's thoughts from different situations that have got experience, and you're surprised what knowledge and help you've got around you in your community and probably in your house or your family.
yep. And you mentioned earlier, the podcast I do, True Freedom, which is on all the usual platforms. I've done parenting teenagers. There's a podcast specifically on that, and I've done one more broadly on parenting. And I talk a lot about the triggers, and taking responsibility for your triggers. So any of the listeners who are interested, the podcast is another way to get some of this information.
And I can 100% advocate even those podcasts. I've listened to them, and I think there's something in that for everyone. If you're not in business, don't necessarily be put off by some of the headlines. Once you get into it, it's stuff for life that touches all of us.
Yeah.
And I suppose I'm going to say something as well. If there's any businesses and people that are purposeful business people that are listening to this podcast that feel like they want to put their energies into making a difference in other communities, do get in touch with us. I won't reel off these things now, but there's lots of different youth-led, young adult-led, creative projects and programs that supporting leadership as well as supporting young people to be the changes they want to see and be. And your support is massively welcomed. And we've seen it before. It makes a huge impact, not only on the young people and the young adults, but also on the business people. For them, whether they're financially supporting or supporting with Skillshare, like the impact on them is huge. So, always welcome to chat if people want to look into that. Bodhi, thanks again. I will hope to see you soon, and take care.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the listeners. Been a pleasure.